At 2:17 in the morning, standing in a nearly empty hospital parking lot with my shoes still damp from melted snow, I stared at my phone and watched my dad's name light up the screen for the 63rd time. I did not feel shock. That was the strange part. I felt something quieter, something settled, like when you finally see a pattern you have been living inside your whole life. The kind of quiet that only comes when you have spent years being the one who adjusts, the one who does not ask, the one who keeps the math running in her head so no one else has to. So I just stood there, my bag still hanging off my shoulder, my fingers stiff from the cold, watching the screen glow in the dark, his name, again and again. The same man who once looked at me across a dinner table and said I was a waste of money, now calling me in the middle of the night like his life depended on it. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it made a kind of sense that felt too clean to ignore. People do not change that suddenly, situations do. I let the call go to voicemail. The parking lot was quiet except for the distant hum of a generator somewhere behind the building, the kind of low mechanical sound that blends into the background if you let it. My breath came out in short clouds. My shoulders ached in that dull, familiar way that comes after a long shift. 14 hours inside fluorescent lights, alarms, and charts. Now this. The phone vibrated again in my hand. I pressed play. His voice came through, strained in a way I had never heard before. He said my name once, then again slower, like he was choosing each word carefully. He said he needed to talk to me, that something had come up at the company, that there were questions, that he knew it had been a long time, but this was important. He did not apologize. He did not ask how I was. He did not mention the years we had not spoken. He just said he needed me. I stood there a moment longer, phone still pressed to my ear even after the message ended, like an idiot who expected more to come through. Of all the things I thought I might hear from him again, that was not it. Need. I pulled the phone away and stared at the screen. 63 missed calls, all from him, within the last hour. That was not concern. That was panic. And panic, in my experience, always left a trail. I unlocked my car but did not get in. I leaned against the door instead, the metal cold through my scrubs, and replayed the message in my head. Company. Questions. Important. He ran Callaway Medical Solutions out of Naperville. Mid-sized. Quietly profitable. The kind of company that never made headlines, which in healthcare usually meant one of two things. They were doing everything right, or they were very good at not being noticed. He had always been good at control. Systems. People. Outcomes. I knew that about him. What I did not know was why he would call me now. We had not spoken in years. Not really. A holiday text once in a while. A short reply. Nothing that required more than a few seconds of thought. I was the one who left. He was the one who let me. That was the arrangement. The phone buzzed again. This time it was not a call. It was an email. From a company address I recognized immediately. Subject line. Documentation review. I stared at it for a second before opening it. The attachment loaded slowly, the way large files always do when you are standing outside in the cold with bad reception and worse patients. I almost closed it, almost, but something in his voice, that tight edge, that careful choice of words, it did not match the man I remembered. So I waited. The file opened. At first, it looked like any other compliance report. Structured, clean, dense with information that would make most people's eyes glaze over in seconds. Not mine. I read the first page quickly. Billing summaries, patient counts, insurance categories. Then I saw it. My name. Not in a reference line. Not in a contact field. In the authorization section. I blinked once, then leaned closer to the screen like that might change what I was seeing. It did not. There it was. Full name. Professional designation. The kind of detail you do not get wrong by accident. And beneath it, a signature. I did not remember signing anything for his company. Not last week, not last year, not ever. I felt something shift inside me. Not a spike of panic, not even anger, just a cold alignment of pieces that had been scattered for a long time. I scrolled, page after page. The same pattern. My name attached to documents I had never seen. Dates that stretched back further than I expected. This was not new. This had been happening. I pushed off the car and finally got inside, closing the door with more force than I meant to. The interior was dark and still. I did not start the engine. I just sat there, the phone glowing in my hand, the file still open. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Usually, when something went wrong, there was a physical reaction, a tightening in my chest, a tremor in my fingers, something. This time, nothing, just clarity. I went back to the email and checked the timestamp. Sent less than 10 minutes ago, meaning he sent it after he started calling. Meaning this was not just about talking, he needed me to see this, or he needed me to fix it. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes for a moment. 8 years of school, years of work after that, building something of my own from nothing. One careful step at a time, no shortcuts, no favors, no safety net. I had spent most of my adult life making sure my name meant something very specific in my field. Reliable, accurate, clean. Now it was attached to something I did not recognize. I let out a slow breath. Of all the ways I thought my dad might try to reach back into my life, this one had not crossed my mind. Not a conversation, not an apology, a paper trail. I opened the file again and zoomed in on the signature. It was close, too close. The angle was slightly off, the pressure inconsistent. Whoever did it had access to something real, something to copy from, not a random attempt. A deliberate one. I shook my head once, more out of habit than disbelief. Looking back, I should have expected something like this. Not the specifics, but the pattern. He had always believed in outcomes over process. If something worked, it worked. The how did not matter as much. I just never thought I would become part of the how. The phone buzzed again. Another call. I let it ring. I wanted to hear what he would say next. Not to the phone, to me, in person, when he could not control the conversation as easily. Because if there was one thing I knew about him, it was that he always had a version of the story that made sense to him. I looked at the dashboard clock. 2:23 in the morning. I should have been driving home. Shower, sleep, back again in a few hours. Instead, I was sitting in a dark parking lot reading documents that could end my career. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable in a way I had learned to recognize. He did not call when things were good. He did not call when things were stable. He called when something needed to be handled. And for the first time in a long time, I was not sure if I was the solution or the problem. I put the phone down in my lap and stared through the windshield. The lot was still empty. The same row of cars, the same flickering light near the far corner. Nothing had changed out there. Everything had changed in here. I picked the phone back up and opened the email again, this time scrolling slower, looking at the details, the dates, the structure, patterns. There were always patterns, and whatever this was, it had been building long before tonight. That was the part that stayed with me, not the calls, not the message, the timeline. He had not reached out when this started. He reached out when it got out of control, which meant I was not being asked to help. I was being brought in because it was already too late. I sat there a while longer, letting that settle. Then I locked the phone, set it down, and finally started the engine. The heater kicked on with a low hum, warm air slowly filling the space. I put the car in drive, and as I pulled out of the parking lot, one thought stayed clear in my mind. This was not a conversation, this was damage control. And somehow, my name was already written all over it. The first time I understood what that really meant, I was sitting at our dining table in Naperville, Illinois, staring at a check that wasn't meant for me. It was late summer 2010. The kind of evening where the air still held heat from the day, and the cicadas outside made that steady, restless sound that filled the silence whether you wanted it or not. Dinner was already on the table when I came downstairs. Mom had made something simple: chicken, rice, green beans. Nothing special, but she had set the table like it mattered. Cloth napkins, the good plates. That usually meant a conversation was coming. Tessa was already sitting there, scrolling through her phone, one leg tucked under her like she owned the space. She barely looked up when I walked in. Dad stood near the counter, not sitting yet, which was another sign. He only stayed on his feet when he wanted control of the room. I took my seat anyway. Same chair I had sat in for years. Same view of the window that looked out onto the backyard. Same feeling that I was about to be evaluated. No one started eating. That was when I knew. Dad cleared his throat once, like he always did before saying something he had already decided. He didn't look at me right away. He looked at the table, then at Mom, then finally at me. He said we needed to talk about college. I remember nodding. Of course we did. That had been the plan my whole life. Good grades, good school, move forward. I had done everything right. I knew the steps. I had followed them. I said I had my acceptance letters. I said I was leaning toward a state school to keep costs reasonable. I said I could work part-time. I had already thought through everything. I had numbers in my head, tuition, books, housing. I was ready. He listened. Or at least he let me finish. Then he shook his head once, slow and final. He said he wasn't going to pay for my college. Just like that, no build-up, no explanation first. Just the decision, dropped on the table like it had always been there. I remember blinking, waiting for the rest of the sentence. There is always a rest of the sentence. A reason, a condition, something. Nothing came. I asked him to repeat it. Not because I didn't hear him, but because I needed to. He said it again, almost the same way. Calm, measured. He said it didn't make sense financially. He said I was capable of figuring it out on my own. He said it would build character. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, feeling something inside me go very still. I looked at Mom. She was already looking down at her plate, adjusting her napkin like it needed fixing. She didn't meet my eyes. I looked back at him. I asked why, not loudly, not dramatically, just a question. He leaned back slightly, like he had expected that, like he had prepared for it. He said he had been thinking about where to put resources. He said it was about return, about investment, about making decisions that made sense long term. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the table, not in front of me, in front of Tessa. That was the moment everything shifted. Tessa looked up slowly, like she already knew something good was about to happen. She didn't ask what it was. She just reached for it, opened it, and pulled out a check. I saw the number before she even reacted. A large one, enough to change things. She smiled, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just pleased. She said thank you like it was expected. I sat there watching it happen, trying to align what I was seeing with what I had been told my whole life. Work hard. Be responsible. Do the right thing. I had done all of that. And somehow I was the one being told no. I asked again. I don't even remember the exact words. Something about fairness, something about the plan we had always talked about. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get defensive. He just explained it like it was obvious. He said Tessa had an opportunity, a boutique idea, something she could build, something that needed support now. He said my path was different, more stable, more predictable. He said I would be fine. That phrase landed heavier than anything else he said. You will be fine. I had heard it before, in smaller ways, when I didn't get something, when I was expected to adjust, when I was told to wait. It always sounded like reassurance. That night, it sounded like a decision. I looked at Tessa. She was already talking about locations, ideas, colors, like the money had already turned into something real in her mind. I looked at Mom again. She still hadn't said a word. I realized then that this conversation had already happened, just not with me. I was the last one to be informed. I asked one more question. Quiet, careful. I asked if there was any part of this that could change. He didn't hesitate. He said no. No explanation, no negotiation, just no. I nodded. I don't remember deciding to nod. It just happened, the same way it always had. Agree, accept, move on. That was what good daughters did. Dinner continued after that, or something like it. Tessa kept talking. Dad responded. Mom added small comments here and there, careful, neutral. I picked at my food. I don't remember tasting anything. At some point, I stood up and took my plate to the sink. No one stopped me. No one said we should keep talking. That was the end of it. Later that night, I sat on the edge of my bed with my laptop open, the glow of the screen, the only light in the room. Student loan applications, interest rates, terms I had never paid attention to before. I filled everything out carefully, line by line, double-checking each entry like it mattered more than anything else. Because it did. There was a moment, somewhere in the middle of it, when I paused. My hands hovered over the keyboard. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry. I just sat there and thought about all the times I had said yes when it would have been easier to say no. All the times I had helped without being asked. All the times I had stepped back so someone else could step forward. And how none of it had been counted. I finished the application, submitted it, closed the laptop. That was my version of a decision. The next morning, the house looked exactly the same. Same kitchen, same light coming through the window, same routine. Mom made coffee. Dad read something on his tablet. Tessa talked about her plans like nothing had changed. I sat at the table with them the same way I always had. No one brought up the conversation from the night before. No one asked how I felt about it. It was already done. I remember thinking, as I stirred my coffee, that this was how things worked in our family. Decisions were made quietly. Outcomes were accepted quietly. And the people who adapted the fastest were the ones who survived. I stood up, took my cup to the sink, and grabbed my bag. Mom asked where I was going. I told her I had things to take care of. She nodded like that made sense. Dad didn't look up. Tessa was still talking. I walked out the front door and stood on the porch for a moment, the morning air cooler than the night before, clearer somehow. I didn't feel dramatic. I didn't feel broken. I felt adjusted. Like something inside me had shifted just enough to make room for a different version of my life. I got in my car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. No one came outside to watch me leave. No one called after me. That was the first time I understood that leaving didn't always require a scene. Sometimes it just required a decision, and I had made mine. The first year after that felt less like a life and more like a series of calculations. I moved into a small apartment just outside campus. One bedroom, thin walls, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbor's television through the night, whether you wanted to or not. The carpet had that faint smell of something that had been cleaned too many times and never quite got clean. It was enough. I told myself that often. It was enough. I worked mornings at a clinic, front desk, and nights shelving inventory at a pharmacy. In between, I went to class, sat in lectures, took notes like my future depended on it. Because it did. There wasn't a moment where I stopped and thought about whether I liked any of it. That was not part of the equation anymore. The equation was simple: input effort, output survival. I remember one night very clearly. It was close to midnight. The grocery store on Maple Avenue had that harsh white lighting that made everything look slightly unreal, like you were standing inside a place that never slept and never changed. I had a basket in my hand, not a cart, just a basket. That was always the first decision. A basket meant limits. A cart meant pretending you had options. I walked through the aisles slowly, reading prices, comparing labels, doing small math in my head. Bread, eggs, a carton of milk. I added them up as I went. Not exact numbers, just enough to stay under what I knew I had left. Then I stopped in front of the cereal. I stood there longer than I needed to. Not because I wanted cereal, but because it gave me a moment to think without moving. In my pocket was a folded piece of paper, my exam registration confirmation. Payment due by the end of the week. I knew the number by heart. I had repeated it enough times that it didn't even feel like a number anymore. It felt like a deadline. I looked down at the basket, then back at the shelf, then down again. I took the milk out first, then the eggs. I left the bread. I put them back carefully, like someone might be watching, even though no one was. That was the decision. Long term over immediate. Always long term. At the register, the total came out lower than I expected. That should have felt like a win. It didn't. The cashier barely looked at me as she scanned the items. I paid, took the bag, and walked out into the parking lot, the cold air hitting my face in a way that felt sharper than it should have. I sat in my car for a minute before starting the engine. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that this was what independence actually looked like. Not freedom. Responsibility without a buffer. I drove back to my apartment, carried the bag upstairs, and set it on the counter. Then I opened my laptop and paid the exam fee. That was the trade. Food for opportunity. I did not question it. There was another night, maybe a few months later, when I came back from a shift that felt longer than it should have been. I dropped my bag by the door, kicked off my shoes, and sat down on the floor instead of the couch. I did not have the energy to take two more steps, my back pressed against the wall, my legs stretched out in front of me. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. No television, no music, just the faint hum of the refrigerator. I closed my eyes. Just for a second, I told myself, I don't know how long I stayed like that. Long enough for the stillness to settle in, for the day to catch up to me all at once. There was a moment where something inside me shifted, not a breakdown, not even close, just a small, quiet acknowledgement. This is hard. That was it. No tears, no dramatic thoughts, just a statement. Then I opened my eyes, pushed myself up, and went to the sink to wash my hands. There were assignments due, notes to review, things that did not wait for how I felt. That became my rhythm. At 20, I learned how to manage time like it was currency. At 22, I learned how to read systems, not just policies and procedures, but the spaces between them, the places where things could go wrong. At 25, I stopped expecting anyone to notice. That last one came easier than I thought it would. The clinic where I worked during the day eventually moved me into more administrative tasks, billing reviews, insurance documentation, the kind of work most people avoided because it was tedious and unforgiving. I found I was good at it. Patterns made sense to me. Discrepancies stood out. A number that didn't belong. A code that was slightly off. A sequence that didn't follow the rules it claimed to follow. It felt like solving problems no one else wanted to see. One afternoon, my supervisor called me into her office. She was a direct person, efficient, not unkind, but not interested in softness either. She slid a file across the desk toward me. She said there was an issue. I opened it and started reading. At first, I didn't see it. Then I did. A small error. A coding mismatch that could have gone unnoticed if no one looked closely. But someone had. She watched me as I went through the pages. Not impatient, just waiting. I felt that same stillness settle in again. I said it was my responsibility. She nodded. She said this kind of mistake could not happen again. She said if it did, there would be consequences. Not raised voices, not threats, just facts. I nodded. That was the moment I understood something clearly. In this field, small errors were not small. They were signals. Signals that something deeper might be wrong, or that someone was not paying attention. I went back to my desk and reviewed every case I had touched that week, then the week before, then the month before. I stayed late, later than anyone else, not because someone told me to, because I needed to know. I needed to be sure. That was when I started thinking differently about the work, not as tasks, as systems. And systems, I learned, always left traces. My grandfather used to say something like that. Not in the language I would use now, but the idea was the same. Money leaves footprints. He had said it once when I was younger, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of him, numbers lined up in neat columns. I didn't understand it then. I did now. By the time I turned 28, I had built a reputation for catching things others missed. Not because I was smarter, because I was careful. There is a difference. Careful means you assume something might be wrong until you prove that it isn't. Smart assumes you will recognize it when it is. I preferred careful. In 2018, I made another decision. It did not feel dramatic at the time. I left the clinic, started my own small compliance consulting service. No big office, no team, just me, a laptop, and a list of contacts I had built over the years. It was not impressive from the outside. From the inside, it was everything. Clients came slowly at first, then more steadily. Reviews, audits, quiet work that did not attract attention, which was exactly the point. I kept my expenses low, my schedule tight, my standards high. There were nights when I wondered if I had made a mistake. Then there were moments when I found something no one else had seen, something that mattered, and I knew I hadn't. I did not call my family to tell them. They did not call to ask. That part stayed consistent. Over time, the silence stopped feeling like absence. It started feeling like space. Space to build something that belonged to me. Not because it was given, because I made it. And somewhere along the way, without noticing exactly when it happened, I stopped thinking of myself as someone who had been left behind. I became someone who had moved on. That difference mattered more than I expected. By the time the years settled into a pattern that felt stable, I could look at my life and see something clear. I was not waiting anymore, not for approval, not for support, not for anything. And that was the part I held on to. Because once you learn how to stand on your own, you don't forget it. Even when someone tries to pull you back into a story you thought you had already finished. I parked across the street from Callaway Medical Solutions just after 10 in the morning, the building looking exactly the way I remembered it. Clean glass, neutral colors. Nothing about it suggested urgency or trouble. If anything, it looked successful. That was always part of the design. I sat in the car for a moment longer than I needed to, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching people move in and out through the front doors. Employees, clients. No one looked panicked. No one looked like something was wrong, which meant one of two things. Either nothing was wrong, or the people who knew were very good at pretending. I grabbed my bag, stepped out, and crossed the street. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and something polished, like wood or leather, the kind of scent that suggested stability, money without saying it out loud. The receptionist looked up as I walked in. She gave me a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I gave my name. There was a brief pause, just long enough to register. Then she nodded, picked up the phone, and said something I couldn't hear. She told me he would see me upstairs. No surprise there. I took the elevator alone. The ride felt longer than it was. A quiet space with too much time to think and not enough distraction. When the doors opened, I stepped into a hallway that hadn't changed. Same carpet, same framed photos on the walls. Awards, certifications, carefully curated success. I knew where his office was without asking. The door was slightly open. I knocked once and pushed it the rest of the way. He was standing behind his desk, not sitting. That detail hadn't changed either. He looked older. That was expected. A little more gray at the temples, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, but his posture was the same, straight, controlled. He said my name, not warmly, not coldly either, just acknowledging that I was there. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It wasn't awkward, it was measured. Like both of us were deciding what version of this conversation we were going to have. He gestured to the chair in front of the desk. I sat. He didn't. He stayed where he was, hands resting lightly on the surface, like he needed the physical anchor. He said he appreciated me coming in. I nodded once. He said there were some issues with documentation, nothing major. Just questions that needed to be clarified before they turned into something more complicated. His voice was calm, even. The same tone he used when explaining something he believed was already under control. I listened. I didn't interrupt. That was something I had learned over the years. Let people explain their version fully before you decide what they are not saying. He talked about billing processes, internal reviews, a recent inquiry from a regulatory body. He used words like routine and procedural. If I hadn't seen the file the night before, I might have believed him, or at least I might have questioned myself. Now I just let him finish. When he stopped, there was a small gap in the conversation, the kind that usually invites reassurance. I didn't offer any. I asked him to show me the documents. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Almost nothing, but enough. Then he reached for a folder on his desk and slid it toward me. Not rushed, not reluctant, just deliberate. I opened it. The paper felt heavier than it should have, thicker, higher quality. That made sense. Companies like this invested in presentation. I flipped through the first few pages quickly. Overview, summary, nothing unexpected. Then I slowed down, line by line, code by code. There were inconsistencies, subtle ones. The kind that would pass unnoticed in a quick review but didn't align when you looked closely. My eyes moved down the page, tracking patterns, matching entries, and then I saw it, my name, printed clearly, in the authorization section, the same place I had seen it the night before. Up close, it looked even more real. Professional designation included. Credentials correct. Everything exactly the way it should be. Except for one thing. I had never signed it. I let my eyes drop to the line beneath. The signature. There it was. Close enough that most people would not question it. Close enough that someone who didn't know me would accept it without hesitation. I felt that same stillness settle in again. I lifted my head slowly and looked at him. He was watching me. Not closely, not intensely, just enough to gauge my reaction. I placed my hand flat on the page. I said I didn't remember signing this. My voice came out steady. That surprised me. He didn't react right away. Then he shrugged slightly, like the question was minor. He said there had been a lot of documents, a lot of communication. It was possible something had been processed through standard channels. Standard channels. I almost smiled at that. I said I would remember something like this. He held my gaze for a moment, then looked away. That was new. He said it might have been handled through someone on his team, that my name could have been included as part of a broader compliance review. He kept his tone light. Reasonable. Like this was a misunderstanding we could clear up quickly. I flipped to the next page. Same structure, same pattern. My name again. Another signature. Different date, earlier than the one before. I felt something tighten, not in my chest, but in my focus. This wasn't a single instance, this was repetition. I turned another page, and another, each one consistent, each one carrying the same detail. My name where it did not belong, my signature where it had never been. I closed the folder, not abruptly, just enough to signal I had seen what I needed to see. I rested my hands on top of it. I asked him when these documents had been submitted. He gave me a general answer. Over the past year, some earlier, some more recent. Not specific. I asked for dates. He paused again. Slightly longer this time. Then he said he would have to check. Of course he would. I nodded. I said I would need full access to everything. Not just summaries, not just selected files, everything. Emails, submission logs, internal communications. If I was going to understand what was happening, I needed the full picture. He studied me for a moment. There was a shift there, small but clear. He wasn't just talking to a daughter anymore. He was talking to someone who understood the implications. He said he could arrange that. He said he trusted me to handle this discreetly. That word landed differently. Trusted. I had not been trusted when it came to my own future. Now I was being trusted with his. I let that sit between us for a second, then I nodded. I said I would review everything and get back to him. He relaxed slightly, not visibly to anyone who didn't know him, but I saw it. The tension in his shoulders eased, his stance shifted just enough. He believed this was moving in the direction he wanted, that I would look at the problem and fix it. That was always his expectation. I stood up. He stayed where he was. For a brief moment, it felt like something might be said that wasn't about documents or processes. It didn't happen. He asked me how soon I could start. I said I already had. Then I picked up the folder and walked toward the door. My hand was on the handle when he spoke again. He said my name. I turned back. He said he knew it had been a long time. He said he appreciated me stepping in, no apology, no acknowledgement of anything beyond the immediate situation, just appreciation for the solution. I nodded once. That was all there was to say. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The same carpet, the same framed awards, the same quiet sense of control. Nothing had changed, except now I knew something I hadn't known before. This wasn't about helping him. It wasn't about fixing a mistake. It was about understanding how long my name had been used without me ever knowing. And as I walked back toward the elevator, the folder still in my hand, one thought stayed clear. They hadn't called me when it started. They called me when they couldn't hide it anymore. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove to a quiet parking lot a few blocks away from my office and sat there with the folder still on the passenger seat, unopened. Not because I didn't want to look at it again, because I already knew what I would find. The question wasn't what, it was how much and how long. I picked up my phone and opened my calendar, cleared the rest of the day, then the next. Work could wait. This couldn't. By the time I got back to my apartment, it was early afternoon, the kind of light that made everything look deceptively calm. I set the folder on my kitchen table, poured a glass of water, and didn't drink it. Then I opened my laptop. There are moments in your life where you can feel yourself shifting from reaction to analysis, from emotion to structure. This was one of them. I logged into my current systems first, pulled up my own records, confirmed what I already knew. Nothing from my end connected to his company. No contracts, no consulting work, no communication. Clean. Then I leaned back, closed my eyes for a second, and opened something I hadn't accessed in years. An old professional email account. The login felt familiar in a way I didn't expect. Muscle memory more than anything else. Passwords still worked. That surprised me. Inbox loaded slowly. Hundreds of old messages. Most irrelevant, outdated threads, notifications, things that belonged to a version of my life I had moved past. I started searching. Company name first. Nothing obvious. Then variations, internal abbreviations, terms I had seen in the documents earlier. That was when things started to appear. Scattered at first. A message here, a forwarded chain there. Nothing that looked like direct communication with me. But that wasn't what I was looking for. I switched to activity logs. That part took longer. The interface was clunky, older system, not designed for easy navigation, which meant most people didn't use it unless they had to. I had to. Login history, access points, timestamps. My eyes moved across the screen, filtering out noise, focusing on what didn't belong. There. An entry that didn't match anything I remembered 2 years ago, late evening. Access from an IP address I didn't recognize. I leaned closer to the screen, scrolled. There were more. Not frequent, not daily, but consistent. Every few weeks. Sometimes months apart. Always from locations that weren't mine. Always at times I knew I wasn't working. I felt something settle deeper this time. Not shock, confirmation. I pulled up the details on one of the entries. Cross-referenced the timestamp with the documents I had seen earlier. They matched. I sat back in my chair and let out a slow breath. This wasn't accidental access. This was usage. Deliberate, repeated, structured. My phone buzzed on the table. I ignored it. Whoever it was could wait. I went back to the logs and started building a timeline. Dates lined up in my notes. Each entry connected to a document. Each document tied to a submission. Patterns. There were always patterns. I worked through the afternoon without noticing the time passing. The light shifted outside. The room dimmed slightly. I didn't turn on a lamp. I didn't need comfort. I needed clarity. Around early evening, something new appeared in my inbox. A message from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line, no signature, just a short line of text. Check the internal archive. Look under revised billing summaries. You didn't authorize this. I stared at it for a second. Then I almost smiled. Someone inside knew, or at least suspected. I didn't reply. Instead, I followed the instruction. Internal archive. Revised billing summaries. The folder wasn't hard to find once I knew what I was looking for. What was inside took longer to process. Multiple versions of the same documents. Original entries, then revisions, then final submissions. The changes were subtle. Adjustments in codes. Slight shifts in classification. The kind of edits that, individually, didn't raise alarms. Together, they told a different story. I opened one file, then another, and there it was again, my name. Not just as an authorization, as a reviewer, as someone who had supposedly validated the changes. I felt a brief, almost detached thought pass through my mind. This is thorough. Whoever did this didn't just use my name once. They built a system around it. I checked the timestamps again. Earlier than I expected. The first instance went back further than 2 years. I scrolled up, then further, until I found it. The earliest entry. 2022. I sat there for a moment, looking at that date. That was the year everything had started to stabilize for me. My business, my clients, my reputation. While I was building something clean, something careful. They were attaching my name to something else entirely. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Not because I needed a break, because I needed to process the scale. This wasn't a mistake that had spiraled. This was a plan that had been executed. My phone buzzed again. This time, I looked. Unknown number. I let it ring. Then it stopped. A second later, a message came through. Different number. Same tone as the email. Short, direct. You should see this too. A file attachment followed. I opened it. An internal email thread. My eyes moved quickly over the text, then slowed as I reached the middle. There were 2 names in the thread that mattered. Dad and Tessa. The conversation was casual, almost routine. They were discussing adjustments, timing, how to handle certain entries without drawing attention. Then a line that made everything else irrelevant. Use Naomi. It looks cleaner. I stared at the screen, not because I didn't understand it, because I did. There was a response. Short. Agreed. She won't be involved anyway. I felt something in my chest shift. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just precise, like a point being marked. I read the exchange again. No hesitation, no concern, just a decision. I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Of all the things I thought I might feel in that moment, anger wasn't the strongest. It was clarity. They hadn't needed me. They had needed what I represented. Clean, reliable, safe. The exact thing he had said I was not worth investing in. I almost laughed, not out loud, just a small internal reaction to the symmetry of it. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, finally taking a sip of the water I had poured hours earlier. It was warm now, flat. I didn't mind. I went back to the table, sat down, and opened my notebook. I started writing dates, times, file names, connections, building a structure out of what I had found, not reacting, documenting. That was the difference between emotion and strategy. Emotion reacts to what is happening. Strategy prepares for what comes next. I worked late into the night. The room went dark except for the light from the screen. The world outside faded. All that mattered was the pattern forming in front of me. By the time I stopped, I had something close to a full timeline. Not perfect, not complete, but enough. Enough to understand what had been done. Enough to know it wouldn't disappear on its own. I closed the laptop slowly, sat there for a moment, then I picked up my phone and scrolled to his contact. I didn't call. Not yet. There was nothing to say that would change anything, not at this stage. I set the phone back down. That was when the decision came. Not dramatic, not loud, just clear. I wasn't going to confront him. Not now. I wasn't going to argue, or accuse, or demand explanations, because explanations didn't change facts, and facts were what mattered. I looked at the folder he had given me earlier, still sitting on the table. He thought I was going to fix this. He thought I was stepping into a problem that had just appeared. He didn't realize I was already inside something that had been built over years. That was his mistake. I stood up, turned off the lights, and walked toward the bedroom. The apartment was quiet again, the same quiet as before. But it felt different now, not empty, focused. As I lay down, staring at the ceiling, one thought stayed with me. They'd used my name because they believed I wouldn't fight back. And for the first time since all of this started, I understood something clearly. They were wrong. I didn't call him the next morning. I didn't send a message. I didn't acknowledge anything I had found the night before. Instead, I got dressed, packed my bag, and drove back to Callaway Medical Solutions like nothing had changed. That was the first move. Act like I was exactly who they thought I was. Someone who would step in. Clean things up. Ask the right questions for the wrong reasons. The lobby looked the same. Calm, ordered, controlled. The receptionist didn't hesitate this time when I gave my name. She picked up the phone immediately, spoke quietly, then told me to go up. I took the elevator again, watching my reflection in the metal paneling. Same face, same expression. Nothing on the outside suggested anything had shifted. That was important. When the doors opened, I walked straight down the hallway without stopping. His office door was closed this time. I knocked once. He told me to come in. He was sitting behind his desk now, which was different from the day before. Papers spread out in front of him. A laptop open to the side. He looked up when I entered. There was something in his expression that wasn't there before. Relief. It was subtle, but it was there. He thought I had come back to help. I took the same chair as before, set my bag down beside me, and placed the folder on the desk between us. I told him I had reviewed the documents. He leaned back slightly, waiting. I said there were inconsistencies. Not accusations, not conclusions, just facts. He nodded. Like that confirmed something he had already decided. He said that was why he had called me. I let that sit for a moment, then I said I would need full access. Not summaries, not selected reports. Everything. Internal systems, billing records, submission logs, communications. If I was going to fix this, I needed to see all of it. He didn't argue. That told me more than anything else. He asked how soon I could start. I said immediately. He reached for his phone, made a call, and within minutes someone came in to set up access credentials. Temporary permissions, he said. Enough to get me what I needed. I nodded. That was all I required. I spent the next few hours in a small conference room down the hall, a laptop in front of me, a stack of files beside me. I worked the way I always did. Quiet, methodical, focused. Except this time, I wasn't just reviewing, I was collecting. Every document I opened, I saved a copy. Every log I accessed, I noted the details. Every inconsistency, every mismatch, every pattern. I built it piece by piece. No one questioned me. That was the advantage of reputation. When people believe you are there to fix something, they don't question how you do it. Around midday, there was a knock on the door. I looked up. Tessa walked in without waiting for a response. She looked exactly the way I remembered her, well put together, effortless in a way that always seemed practiced. She smiled when she saw me. It wasn't warm, it wasn't cold, it was familiar. She asked how it was going. I told her I was still reviewing. She nodded like that was expected. Then she walked around the table, glanced at the screen, and leaned slightly against the edge. She said she knew I would figure it out. I didn't respond. She kept talking. She said things had gotten complicated, that the business had grown faster than expected, that sometimes things slipped. The way she said it made it sound like a scheduling issue, like a shipment that arrived late. I watched her for a moment. Then I asked her directly if she had been involved in the submissions. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she said she had helped where she could. Helped. That word again. I nodded. She smiled again, softer this time. Then she said something that stayed with me. She said I always handled things better than anyone else. That I was the one who kept everything steady. That I would fix this. And then, almost as an afterthought, she added that I had always been like that. The one who was fine. The one who could take it. I felt something shift again. Not emotional, structural. That was how they saw me. Not as someone who deserved protection, as someone who didn't need it. I said I would let her know if I needed anything. She nodded, satisfied, and left the room. The door closed behind her. I stared at the screen for a few seconds after she was gone. Then I went back to work. Later that afternoon, I was called into a different office, not his, a smaller one, less polished. A man was sitting behind the desk when I walked in. He stood when he saw me, introduced himself as Evan Pike, federal investigator. That explained the tone in the voicemail. He gestured for me to sit. I did. He asked how I was connected to the company. I told him I wasn't, not directly. He watched me carefully. Then he said my name had come up in their review. Of course it had. I nodded. He asked if I had been involved in any of the recent submissions. I said no. He didn't react immediately, just noted something on the file in front of him. Then he asked if I had reviewed any documents recently. I said I had just started. That was true. He asked if I had noticed anything unusual. I paused, not because I didn't know what to say, because I was deciding how much to say. Then I told him there were inconsistencies, that I was still going through the records. He leaned back slightly, studying me. Then he said something that almost made me smile. He said people who had nothing to hide usually answered faster. I met his gaze. I told him people who understood the implications usually answered more carefully. There was a brief silence. Then he nodded once. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. He said they would be in touch. I stood up. He did not stop me. As I walked out of that office, I could feel the pressure shifting, not just from one direction, from both. Dad expected me to fix it. The investigation expected me to explain it. And somewhere in the middle was the truth. I went back to the conference room and closed the door behind me. The space felt smaller now, more focused. I sat down, opened my laptop, and continued. By the time evening came, I had enough. Not everything, but enough to understand the structure. Enough to see where it started, where it expanded, where it broke. I packed up slowly, organizing the files, making sure nothing was left behind. Then I stood, took one last look around the room, and walked out. As I passed his office, the door was open. He looked up, asked how it was going. I told him I was making progress. He nodded, satisfied. Of course he was. I walked past without stopping, back through the hallway, down the elevator, out into the evening air. It was colder than the day before. The kind of cold that made everything feel sharper, clearer. I got into my car, closed the door, and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. For the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel like I was reacting. I felt like I was positioning. There is a difference between being pulled into something and stepping into it on your own terms. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel and started the car. Because now I wasn't the one trying to understand what had happened. I was the one deciding what would happen next. The next morning, I didn't go back to the office. Instead, I drove out toward the older part of Naperville, the quieter neighborhoods where the houses sat further back from the road and the trees had grown tall enough to block out most of the noise. Nora lived in a small duplex not far from the courthouse where she interned. Law school had given her a kind of focus I recognized, not polished yet, but sharp in the right places. She opened the door before I could knock a second time. She looked at me for a moment, taking in more than I had said. Then she stepped aside and let me in. Her place smelled like coffee and paper. Stacks of books on the table, case files spread out in neat but crowded lines. She asked if I wanted something to drink. I said no. We both knew I wasn't there for that. I set my bag down and pulled out the documents I had printed the night before. Not everything, just enough to frame the conversation. She didn't reach for them right away. She watched me first. Then she asked what I needed. I told her I needed to understand the will, not just the summary version everyone knew, the full structure. Her expression shifted slightly. She said the will had already been executed, that everything had been settled months ago after grandfather passed. I nodded. I said I knew. Then I told her I needed to see the original language. That was when she picked up the papers. We sat at our table, side by side, the kind of quiet that only exists when two people understand the weight of what they are about to look at. She pulled up the document on her laptop and started scrolling. Legal language has a rhythm to it, dense, precise, layered in a way that forces you to slow down whether you want to or not. I followed along. Asset distribution, trust structures, conditions. It was thorough. That didn't surprise me. Grandfather had always been that way. Careful. Exact. The kind of man who didn't leave things open to interpretation. We moved through the sections one by one. Then Nora paused. Her finger hovered over a paragraph halfway down the page. She didn't say anything at first, she just looked at it. Then she said there was something here that most people hadn't paid attention to. That was not what I wanted to hear. I leaned closer. She read it out loud, slower than necessary, making sure each word landed. If at any point it is determined that assets within the family structure have been materially influenced by fraudulent activity, including, but not limited to, misrepresentation and financial reporting, all designated inheritances shall be voided and redirected to the charitable trust outlined in Section 4. I didn't move. For a second, it felt like the room had shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough to change the angle of everything. I asked her to read it again. She did. Same words, same tone. No ambiguity. I sat back in my chair. This wasn't a safeguard, this was a trigger. A condition that didn't just protect the assets, it erased them. I asked her how enforceable it was. She didn't hesitate. She said it was solid, tied to federal standards, clear definitions, no room for interpretation if the criteria were met. I nodded slowly. Then I asked what counted as fraudulent activity in this context. She looked at me for a moment before answering. Then she said it would include intentional misrepresentation in billing, financial reporting, or documentation tied to income or valuation. My mind moved through the pieces I had collected. Billing adjustments, revised submissions, my name attached to documents that weren't mine. I asked her what would happen if something like that was proven. She didn't soften it. She said everything would be forfeited, all assets, no exceptions. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. There it was. Not just consequences, total loss. I stood there for a moment without moving, not because I didn't understand it, because I did. $5 million. Dissolved. Not redirected to any of them, redirected entirely away. Dad's company, Tessa's accounts, everything they had built their version of stability on. And somewhere underneath that, a thought I didn't want to examine too closely. They were still my family. Whatever that word had meant, whatever it still meant. I could walk away from this room and say nothing. Let the investigation run its course without my testimony. My name would still be cleared eventually. The logs existed whether I presented them or not. That was the easier version. I stayed at the window a moment longer than I needed to, then I turned back, not because I had decided something new, because I remembered something I already knew. My name was in those documents, not by accident, not by oversight, by decision. And silence, in this case, wouldn't be neutrality. It would be the same choice they had already made for me, just pointed in a different direction. I went back to the table and sat down. Cars passing occasionally. Nothing out of place. Everything normal. Except it wasn't. I turned back to her. I asked if anyone else knew about this clause. She shook her head. She said most of the family focused on the distribution sections. Who got what, how much. Not the conditions. Conditions were usually treated like formalities. Something you skim, something you assume will never matter. I almost smiled at that. That was the mistake. Assuming something will never matter. I went back to the table and sat down. I asked her one more question. If evidence existed. Clear, documented evidence. Enough to meet the threshold. Would it be automatic? She said it would initiate a review. Then, if confirmed, the clause would activate. I nodded. That was enough. She closed the laptop slowly and looked at me, really looked at me this time. Then she asked what this was about. I considered the question, not because I didn't know the answer, because I was deciding how much to share. I told her there were issues with the company, that my name had been used in ways I hadn't authorized, that there was an investigation already in motion. Her expression didn't change much, but I saw the shift, concern, calculation. She asked if I was involved. I said no. She nodded once. Then she asked if I was sure. That question landed differently, not accusatory, careful. I met her gaze and said I was sure. She held that for a second. Then she leaned back slightly. She said if that was true, then I needed to be very careful about how I moved forward. That anything I did from this point on would matter, not just for the investigation, for everything connected to it. I understood what she meant. This wasn't just about proving something, it was about timing, about positioning, about making sure the truth didn't get buried under something louder. I gathered the papers from the table and placed them back in my bag. She didn't try to stop me. She didn't offer advice I didn't ask for. That was something I respected about her. She trusted that I understood the implications. At the door, she spoke again. She said if I was going to pursue this, I needed to be prepared for the outcome. Not just legally, personally. I paused with my hand on the door. Then I asked her what she meant. She said that once something like this starts, it doesn't just affect one part of your life. It changes everything connected to it, family included. I nodded. That part wasn't new. What was new was how complete the impact could be. I stepped outside into the afternoon light. The air felt colder than it should have for that time of day. Or maybe I just noticed it more. I walked to my car slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I was aligning everything I had learned. The documents, the emails, the timeline, and now this. A clause that didn't just punish, it erased. I sat in the driver's seat, closed the door, and rested my hands on the steering wheel. For a moment, I didn't start the engine. I just sat there. There is a point in any situation where things stop being abstract, where the consequences move from possibility to probability. This was that point. If I moved forward, there would be no partial outcome, no small correction, no quiet resolution. Everything would come down, not just the company, everything tied to it. I thought about Dad, about the way he had stood behind that desk, calm, controlled, certain that this was something I would fix. I thought about Tessa, about the way she had smiled, confident that I would absorb whatever needed to be handled. And for a brief moment, I considered the alternative. I could step back, say nothing, let it unfold without me, protect myself, walk away. That would be the simplest path, but it wouldn't be the cleanest, because my name was already in it, and silence wouldn't remove it, it would just leave it there, attached to something I didn't build, something I didn't agree to, something that could define everything I had worked for. I started the engine. The sound filled the space, steady and familiar. I adjusted my grip on the wheel and looked straight ahead. There are decisions you make out of emotion, and there are decisions you make because you understand the structure of what you're dealing with. This was the second kind. I wasn't going to step back. I wasn't going to negotiate, and I wasn't going to give them a chance to contain it, because now I knew the full scope. And once you see that clearly, there is only one direction left: forward. The hearing room in Washington felt colder than it should have, even with the heat running. Not physically cold. Controlled. Regulated. The kind of space where everything was designed to keep emotion out and facts in. I arrived early. That was intentional. I always preferred to see a room before it filled, to understand the layout, the angles, where people would sit, where they would look. It gave me a sense of structure, and structure mattered. I sat near the back at first, watching as people moved in. Lawyers, staff, investigators. Quiet conversations, papers being organized, chairs shifting slightly on the floor. No one paid attention to me. That was fine. I wasn't there to be noticed yet. When Dad walked in, the room adjusted around him in a way that was familiar, not dramatic. Just a subtle shift in attention. He still carried that presence, that sense of control. Tessa walked in beside him, slightly behind, like she had always done. Mom followed. That was the part I hadn't expected. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, something else. Like the space she occupied had changed. She saw me before the others did. Our eyes met for a second. She didn't smile. She didn't look away either. Then she lowered her gaze and took her seat. That was the first time something felt different. Dad noticed me next. He gave a small nod. Not warm, not distant. Acknowledgement. He expected me to be there. Of course he did. I had told him I was working on it. To him, this was the next step in that process. Fix the problem. Present the solution. Close the gap. The hearing began without ceremony. Names were called. Positions stated. The structure of the review outlined. Evan Pike was there, seated across from where I had been asked to sit when my name came up. He didn't look at me immediately. He didn't need to. He already knew I was part of this. When it was time, Dad stood. He spoke clearly, measured, the same way he always had when he wanted to control a narrative. He described the company, the growth, the recent questions raised about documentation. Then he introduced me, not as his daughter, as a compliance specialist, someone brought in to review and clarify the inconsistencies. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was predictable. He was positioning me, placing me exactly where he needed me to be, between the problem and the solution. I stood when my name was called, walked to the front, sat down. The room felt different from there, closer, sharper. Every movement carried weight. Every word mattered. They asked me to confirm my role. I said I had been asked to review documentation, that I had begun that process. That was true. They asked if I had identified inconsistencies. I said yes, also true. They asked if I believed those inconsistencies could be resolved through clarification. I paused, just long enough. Then I said I was still reviewing the full scope, careful, precise, not a lie. Not the full truth either. That was when it shifted. Tessa stood. She didn't wait to be asked. She said she wanted to clarify something. Her voice was steady, confident. She said that I had been involved in reviewing documents prior to the inquiry, that I had approved certain submissions, that I was familiar with the processes being questioned. For a moment, the room stilled. Not dramatically, just enough to register the change. I turned my head slightly and looked at her. She didn't look back at me. She was looking forward, at them, presenting, positioning, just like Dad had. I felt that same internal alignment settle into place. Of course, if something went wrong, it needed a direction, and I was the most convenient one. Evan leaned forward slightly, asked her to clarify. She did. She spoke about timelines, about my supposed involvement, about how I had always been the one who handled these things. That phrase again, handled. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react, because reaction would have given her something to push against. Instead, I waited until she finished. Then I reached into my bag, pulled out my laptop, opened it. The sound of the keyboard felt louder than it should have in that room. I connected it to the display they had set up. That part had been arranged earlier. They expected me to present. They just didn't expect what I would present. I pulled up the login records. Clean, structured, time-stamped. I didn't rush. I let them see it the way I had, piece by piece. I pointed to the entries, access times, locations, dates. Then I said that these were the instances where my credentials had been used. I didn't say by me. I didn't need to. The timestamps spoke for themselves. I pointed to one. Late evening. A date I knew exactly where I had been. Working. Logged in under a different system, different location. Impossible to overlap. I moved to another. Different time. Same pattern. Then another. And another. A sequence. Not random. Not accidental. Deliberate. The room shifted again, more noticeably this time. Evan stood, walked closer to the screen, studied the entries. Then he asked me directly if I had authorized any of those sessions. I said no. No hesitation, no explanation, just no. He nodded once, not approval, recognition. Tessa spoke again, said that access didn't necessarily mean misuse, that systems could be shared, that there were multiple people involved. Her voice was still steady, but there was a slight edge now, a tightening. I turned to her, met her eyes, for the first time since she had started speaking. Then I opened another file, the email thread, the one I had received the night before. I didn't introduce it dramatically. I just displayed it. Let the words sit there. Use Naomi. It looks cleaner. Agreed. She won't be involved anyway. No commentary needed. No interpretation required. The room went quiet in a different way. Not controlled, not structured. Heavy. I heard a chair shift somewhere behind me. Paper moving. A breath that was held a second too long. I didn't look at Dad immediately. I didn't need to. I knew what that moment meant. Instead, I glanced to the side. Mom was watching me, not the screen. Me. Her expression didn't change much. But there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not surprise, not even regret. Recognition. Like she was seeing something she had always known, but never had to face directly. She didn't say anything. But her hands, which had been folded in her lap the entire morning, moved. Just slightly. She placed one flat on the table in front of her, like she was steadying something, or like she was done holding herself together in a particular way. She didn't look at Dad. She didn't look at Tessa. She looked at me. And for a second, 1 second, I saw something I had not seen at that dinner table 16 years ago. Not apology, not regret, just acknowledgement that she had seen it then too, and had chosen not to. Then she looked down, and that was the last time I looked at her. I turned back to the front. Evan was still standing near the screen. He asked where I had obtained the email. I said it had been sent anonymously. That was true. He asked if I had verified its authenticity. I said I had cross-referenced it with internal timestamps and document revisions. Also true. He nodded. Then he looked toward Dad. That was the first time the focus shifted fully. Dad hadn't spoken. Not since he introduced me. He stood there now, posture still straight, but something in the stillness had changed. Not control. Containment. He was calculating. Assessing. Deciding what to say next. But for the first time, he didn't have the structure of the room fully in his favor. I closed the laptop slowly, not to end the moment. To mark it. There was nothing more to add. Not yet. The facts were on the table. Clear. Documented. Unavoidable. I sat back in the chair, hands resting lightly on the table in front of me. And as the room adjusted to what had just been placed in it, one thing became clear. This was no longer a situation that could be explained away. It had moved into something else. Something that couldn't be contained by careful words or controlled tone. Something that had already begun to unfold in ways none of them had planned. And for the first time since this started, I could feel the balance shift. And as that silence settled, something else became clear to me. It wasn't just that the room had changed. It was that the story they had built no longer had control over how it would end. I sat there for a few seconds longer than necessary, watching the way people avoided direct eye contact now, the way papers were handled more carefully, like every detail suddenly carried weight. That shift always happens when certainty breaks. Not loudly, but completely. I glanced once more toward Mom. She hadn't moved much, but her hands were folded tighter now, fingers pressed together in a way I recognized from years ago. That was how she held herself when something could no longer be ignored. Not confronted, just acknowledged. She looked up briefly, and for a moment it felt like she might say something. Anything. But she didn't. And somehow that silence said more than anything she could have offered. I turned away first, not out of avoidance, out of completion. Because there was nothing left to resolve between us in that room. What needed to be seen had already been seen. What needed to be said had already been placed where it couldn't be taken back. And as I gathered my things, the weight I had been carrying since that first night in the parking lot finally shifted. Not lifted. Transferred. From me to the truth itself. That was the difference. I didn't have to hold it anymore. It would hold on its own. It didn't happen all at once. There was no loud moment, no sudden break, just a quiet recalibration in the room. People stopped looking at me as the solution. They started looking at me as a source. And that was where everything changed. Evan was the first to speak again. He asked if I had additional documentation beyond what had already been presented. I did. I reached into my bag again, this time pulling out a structured file. Printed, indexed, organized in a way that made it easy to follow. Not because I needed it, because they did. I handed it forward. He took it, flipped through the first few pages, then signaled for it to be distributed. As the copies moved across the table, I began to speak. Not loudly, without hesitation, just clearly. I said the documents in front of them represented a timeline. Access logs matched against submission records. Submission records matched against billing adjustments. Billing adjustments matched against financial reporting. Each layer connected to the next. I didn't rush. I let each piece land before moving to the next. I pointed to the earliest entries. 2022. The beginning of the pattern. I explained how the changes started small, minor adjustments, classification shifts that could pass unnoticed in isolation. Then I moved forward. 2023, the volume increased. More entries, more revisions. The same structure repeated, always under my name, always tied to approvals I had never given. I paused there, let them see the progression. Then I continued. I explained how the revisions aligned with billing increases, not random, targeted, specific categories, specific accounts, the kind that would generate higher returns without immediate flags. There was movement around the table, pages turning, pens writing, the sound of documentation being processed. Dad spoke then. He said there were explanations for the discrepancies, that the system had undergone updates, that there had been internal changes that might not be fully reflected in the records. His voice was steady, controlled, the same tone he had used at the beginning, but it didn't land the same way, because now it was being measured against evidence, not assumption. Evan looked up from the file. He asked if those updates had been documented. Dad said they were in process. That response sat in the air for a second, then it moved past him. Because it wasn't enough, I continued. I moved to the internal communications, emails, message logs, references between team members. I pointed out the language, not dramatic, not overt, but consistent. Instructions framed as suggestions, decisions framed as adjustments, the kind of phrasing that allowed responsibility to shift, but not disappear. Tessa spoke again, her voice sharper now. She said the emails were being taken out of context, that internal discussions often sounded different when isolated. That didn't mean wrongdoing. I nodded. That part was true. Context mattered. So I provided it. I pulled up additional threads, extended conversations, sequences that showed not just the message, but the response. The pattern didn't change. It reinforced itself. Each message building on the last. Each decision moving in the same direction. I watched her as I did it. The confidence she had walked in with was still there, but it was thinner now, more effort behind it. She tried again. Said that involvement didn't equal intent, that mistakes could happen in complex systems. I agreed. Mistakes did happen, but I pointed to the frequency, the repetition, the alignment across multiple records. That wasn't random, that was structure. Dad tried to interrupt again, this time more directly. He said we were moving too quickly to conclusions, that there needed to be a full internal review before any external interpretation. Evan raised his hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough, and Dad stopped. That was the moment I knew the control had shifted completely. I continued. I moved to the access records again, highlighted the entries that corresponded with the revisions, different locations, different times, consistent use of my credentials. I explained that I had verified my own activity logs separately, that there was no overlap, no authorization, no involvement. The room was quiet again. Not the controlled quiet from earlier. Something else, something heavier. I closed the final document, placed it on the table. Then I spoke the one thing that hadn't been said directly yet. I said I was not there to fix this. I let that sit for a second. Then I said I was there because my name had been used. Not once, not by mistake, but repeatedly. And without my knowledge, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't look at anyone in particular, I just said it, and that was enough. Because the truth, when it is clear, does not need volume, it needs space. Evan looked at me for a moment, then he nodded, not agreement, recognition. He turned to the others, spoke in a tone that was different from before, more direct, more defined. He said that based on the evidence presented, there was sufficient cause to move forward with a formal investigation. He said additional records would be subpoenaed, that access to internal systems would be expanded, that all parties involved would be required to provide full documentation. There was movement again, more deliberate this time, not just processing, action. Dad didn't speak, not immediately. He stood there, hands resting on the table, posture still straight. But the stillness was different now, not control, containment breaking. Tessa looked at him, then at me, then back at the table. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left that would shift what had already been established. Mom remained quiet. She hadn't spoken the entire time. But I could feel her presence, not behind me, not beside me, somewhere between, watching, absorbing, understanding. Or maybe just finally seeing. I sat there for a moment longer, letting the room settle into its new structure. Then I gathered my things, not rushed, not hesitant, just finished. As I stood, Evan spoke again. He said he would need to follow up with me. I nodded. That was expected. He didn't need to say anything else. We both understood the position now. I turned toward the door. Dad said my name. I stopped, not because I had to, because I chose to. I turned slightly. He looked at me. For the first time since this began, there was no clear direction in his expression. No control, no strategy, just a pause. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He just looked at me like he was trying to understand something that had already moved beyond him. I held his gaze for a second. Then I turned back and walked out. The hallway felt different, louder somehow, even though no one was speaking. I stepped outside into the air, the cold sharper now, more defined. I took a breath, then another. Not to calm down, just to reset. Because what had just happened wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The investigation would move forward, the structure would unfold, and everything that had been hidden under layers of careful decisions would start to surface. I walked down the steps slowly, the sound of my shoes against the concrete steady, grounded. There was no rush, no urgency to get away. Because for the first time since all of this started, I wasn't carrying the uncertainty anymore. I had placed it where it belonged, and now it would move on its own. And as I stepped outside into the cold, I realized there was one more layer to what had just happened, not in the room, but in me. For years, I had believed that if I ever faced them again, it would feel like confrontation, like something sharp, like something I would have to push through. But it didn't feel that way. It felt quiet. Not because it was easy, because it was clear. I walked a little further down the steps than I needed to, letting the distance settle between me and the building behind me. The air carried that faint metallic edge that always comes with winter in the city, sharp enough to keep you awake, grounded enough to keep you present. I paused near the edge of the sidewalk and looked back once, not at the people, not at the room, at the structure, at the system that had held everything together for so long. And for the first time, I didn't see it as something powerful. I saw it as something dependent on silence, on assumption, on the idea that no one would ever question it closely enough to break it apart. That was the part they had miscalculated, not me, the structure itself. I thought about all the years before this, all the times I had stayed quiet, adjusted, moved around things instead of through them, not because I didn't see them, because I didn't believe I had a position strong enough to challenge them. That belief had been the only thing holding it in place, not the system, not the people, the belief. I exhaled slowly and turned back toward the street. There was nothing left for me inside that building, no conversation that would change what had already been set in motion, No explanation that would alter what had already been seen. That was the difference between truth and argument. Truth doesn't require agreement, it only requires exposure. I walked to my car, each step steady, not rushed. And as I reached for the door handle, one final thought settled in. I hadn't taken anything from them. I hadn't forced anything. I had simply stopped carrying what wasn't mine. And once I did that, everything else followed, without me having to hold it together. 6 months passed in a way that felt both slow and exact. The kind of time that doesn't rush forward but moves with intention, like everything is being processed whether you are watching it or not. I didn't attend the hearings that followed. I didn't sit in rooms and listen to lawyers repeat what had already been established. I didn't need to. The truth had already been placed where it belonged. After that, the system did what it was designed to do. I received updates the same way I had received everything else, through documents, through confirmations, through short, precise statements that didn't carry emotion, only outcome. My dad was formally charged. Not in a dramatic moment, not with cameras or noise, just a sequence of legal steps that moved forward without asking for permission. The company he had built over decades didn't collapse all at once. It folded. Contracts were reviewed, accounts were frozen, partnerships dissolved quietly. People who had once depended on that structure stepped away one by one until there was nothing left to hold it up. I saw it in the filings. Revenue projections removed, assets reassessed, operations suspended. It wasn't chaos, it was removal. The kind that happens when something is no longer allowed to continue. Tessa's situation unraveled faster. That part didn't surprise me. She had always depended on support that looked like stability, but when that support disappeared, there was nothing underneath it. No structure, no system, just appearance. Her accounts were frozen early, her business shut down not long after. I heard through someone who knew someone. Not directly, she never reached out. Not once. I thought about that for a moment, not with anger, just with understanding. Reaching out would have required acknowledgement. And acknowledgement would have meant facing something she had never been asked to face before. Mom sent one message, 3 weeks after the hearing, a single line. I hope you are well. I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it, because I was deciding what it meant. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't an explanation. But it wasn't nothing either. She had sat in that room, she had seen the screen. She had watched her daughter place evidence on a table that ended the life her husband had built. And then she had gone home. And 3 weeks later, she had opened her phone and typed 4 words. I thought about writing back. I drafted something twice. Both times I deleted it. Not because I was angry, because I understood that some distances don't close with a reply. They close or they don't with time. And I wasn't ready to find out which one this was. I set the phone down, and I left it there. The will was reviewed under the clause Nora had shown me. That part took time, not because it was unclear, because it had to be confirmed, verified, applied exactly the way it was written. When the final decision came through, it was as precise as everything else. All designated inheritance was voided. Every asset that had been tied to the family structure was redirected into the charitable trust. Over $5 million that had once been divided in expectation was gone. Not transferred, not reassigned, removed. I didn't receive anything. That wasn't a loss. That was a decision. I could have argued for a portion, could have tried to separate myself from the outcome, but I didn't. Because money that comes through something like that doesn't arrive clean. It carries the structure of how it was created. And I had spent too many years building something that didn't depend on that. My name was cleared, officially, documented. Every instance of unauthorized access identified, every record corrected, everything that had been attached to me without my knowledge removed. That was the only part that mattered. Not the outcome for them, not the collapse of what they had built. Just that one thing. My name meant what I had built it to mean, nothing more, nothing less. Life didn't change in a dramatic way after that. There was no moment where everything felt different. It just continued. Work, clients, quiet routines that didn't require attention to function. The kind of life that doesn't need to prove itself to anyone. There were moments when the past would try to surface. a familiar street, a building I recognized, a conversation that sounded too much like something I had already heard. But they passed. Because once something is fully understood, it loses its hold. It becomes information. And information, if you use it correctly, gives you control. That was what stayed, not what they did, but what I learned from it. One evening, after a long day, I sat in my car outside my apartment, engine off, hands resting lightly in my lap. The quiet felt familiar. Not empty, just still. I picked up my phone without thinking, scrolled through my contacts, names that belonged to my current life, people I spoke to, people who knew me as I was now. Then I saw it, his name. Still there. Not because I had held on to it, because I hadn't needed to remove it until now. I stared at it for a moment. There was no anger, no hesitation, just recognition, like seeing something that no longer belonged where it was. I tapped it, opened the contact, looked at it one last time, then I deleted it. The screen shifted slightly as the name disappeared, and that was it. No sound, no reaction, just absence. I set the phone down, leaned back against the seat, and let the quiet settle in again. There are people who believe that survival means you owe something, that if you made it through, if you built something on your own, then you should go back, help, fix, carry what others couldn't. I used to think that too. I don't anymore. Surviving doesn't create obligation, it creates perspective. And perspective, if you allow it, shows you exactly where you stand. I started the engine. The familiar sound of it settled something I hadn't realized was still unsettled. I adjusted my grip on the wheel and looked ahead. There was nothing pulling me backward, nothing unfinished, nothing waiting, just the road in front of me. And as I pulled out of the parking spot, I realized something else I hadn't fully seen before. There had been a time when I thought closure would feel like something, like a moment, a shift, a release that would arrive all at once and settle everything that came before it. But it didn't happen that way. There was no single point where I felt finished. It was quieter than that. It showed up in small things, in the way I no longer replayed old conversations in my head, in the way I stopped wondering if I could have done something differently, in the way I didn't feel the need to explain my decisions to anyone. That was what closure actually looked like, not an answer. An absence of questions. A few weeks after everything had settled, I was reviewing a file late in the evening, the kind of case that required careful attention but no urgency. I remember pausing, looking at a detail that didn't quite align, and feeling that familiar focus settle in. The same instinct that had carried me through all of it. Careful, precise, uncompromising. And for a moment, I thought about how that part of me had been shaped, not by support, not by encouragement, but by necessity, by learning early that if I didn't pay attention, no one else would. I didn't resent that anymore, because it had given me something they could never take back. The ability to see clearly, the ability to decide for myself, the ability to stand in a situation and not be moved by pressure, expectation, or history. That was worth more than anything that had been lost. I finished the review, closed the file, and shut down my laptop. The apartment was quiet again, the same quiet I had once filled with effort and uncertainty. Now it felt different, complete. I walked to the window and looked out at the street below. Lights from passing cars moved steadily through the dark. People going somewhere, coming back from somewhere. Lives continuing in ways that didn't require explanation. I stood there for a minute, then turned away. There was nothing left to look back at. And for the first time in a long time, I understood something fully. I didn't need the past to resolve. I needed it to end. And it had. Not because it was fixed, but because I stopped carrying it. There are people who believe that survival means you owe something, that if you made it through, if you built something on your own, then you should go back. Help. Fix. Carry what others couldn't. I used to think that too. I don't anymore. Surviving doesn't create obligation, it creates perspective. And perspective, if you allow it, shows you exactly what was always true, not what they said you were, what you actually are.